Well, not only are we going to need in dynamic communication some preparation to speak, and not only are we going to need to think before we speak, but the third thing, if we're really going to become dynamic communicators, that we need is this. We really need to be people who begin with our spouse's needs in mind. Now, this is huge. I run into a lot of people who never really communicate from the vantage point of what are the needs of my spouse. Because what do? In our communication, in our conversations, here's what we normally do. We go into a conversation, maybe it's at work, maybe it's with your spouse, maybe it's with a friend, and here's what we do. We come into that conversation and we have thought through, what is my agenda? What are my goals? What are my ideas that I want to get across to the other person? And some of us, we even go so far as to think through like a mental chess game. We're going to play a mental chess game with this person, and it's quite manipulative, if you want to know the truth, of if they say this, I'm going to jump here and say this. And if they say that, I'm going to move this piece here. And so we think through this mental chess game with folks of how am I going to get my ideas, my agenda across to them. And the reality is we have it just backwards. Because what God would have us to do is to do what it says in Philippians 2, and that is to do this, to think of others more highly than ourselves, right? And in communication, what we have to do is we have to put the other's needs first. There's a book by Dr. Willard Harley that he wrote called His Needs, Her Needs. Great book. Get it if you want a book that really helps you to understand the opposite sex and what their needs are. But in this book, His Needs, Her Needs, here's what he says. He says that there are 5 top needs of a man and 5 top needs of a woman. And I just want to go through and list these for you. You might want to jot some of these down, and it could really be a lens for you to understand where your spouse may be coming from in terms of needs. He says this. He says that the needs of a man are these. Number 1, sexual intimacy. Like any of us didn't understand that, okay? So sexual intimacy. 2 is recreational companionship. 3 is an attractive spouse. 4 is domestic support. And 5 is admiration. So sexual intimacy, recreational companionship, the need for an attractive spouse, domestic support, and admiration. Those, ladies, are your spouse's top 5 needs. And then the needs of a woman are quite different, but some of them have a little bit of overlap. First one is affection. Second is conversation, right? It's not all about the sexual intimacy that a man needs. She needs more of the relational intimacy. So affection, conversation. Thirdly is the need for financial security. 4th is commitment to the family, right? You are committed to the family and you make that commitment higher than some of those other things. And then lastly is a need for openness and honesty. So you've got conversation, affection, openness and honesty, financial security, and then commitment to the family. And those are the 5 top needs of women. And man, if we can just run all of our conversations and discussions through those needs and think about how do I start with those needs in mind, it could be huge. So are you running the words you say and how you say them through that kind of grid? And it's very natural for us to want somebody to communicate with us from the standpoint of what our needs are. Because you know what? We have something in the back of our brains called the RAS. The RAS is the reticular activation system. And it's this little bitty filter. And if we didn't have this RAS, let me tell you what would happen. Everything, all stimuli in our world would come into our brains and overload it. So everything you see, everything you hear, everything you touch, everything would come into our minds, and it just kind of short circuit it. But what the RAS does is this. It provides that there are 3 key things that get through that filter that make us be people who truly do communicate with others well and really, really listen to what's being said or done. And let me tell you what those 3 things are. It's things that 1, threaten us, 2, things that are unique, and 3, things that we value. And so you think about those 2 things, threatening and valuing and unique. And so we could interact with our spouse or significant other in a way that was unique. I mean, I could dye my hair blue and try to get my wife's attention that way. And certainly she'd say, wow, that was a unique conversation because you were crazy. You look crazy. But uniqueness probably isn't the best way to go about it in relationships. Or you could have something that threatens your spouse. Now that's probably not a legitimate way to interact with your spouse in a loving relationship. So what are we left with? Things that we value. And so when we start off with the needs of our spouse in mind first, when I start off with my wife's top needs, what happens is she will listen because it registers in her mind as something she values because I'm caring about her needs first. Preparing to communicate, thinking before we speak, absolutely beginning with the other person's needs in mind first, and then fourth,